Deep in the Canadian wilderness, far from prying eyes, a man named Theriot built a nightmarish commune that would become one of the most disturbing cults in history, the Anthill Kids. At first he was charismatic, convincing followers that he was a prophet, a messenger of God, but behind the religious rhetoric was a twisted mind. Theriot's community started as a utopian escape from the modern world, but soon the isolated compound became a prison of torture, abuse, and horror. His followers, mostly women, were forbidden from contacting the outside world. They worked endlessly, breaking their bodies to serve their leader. He controlled every aspect of their lives, claiming divine authority, and anyone who disobeyed suffered unspeakable punishment. Theriot subjected his followers to horrific physical mutilations. He performed brutal surgeries on them without anesthesia, justifying the pain as a test of faith. He extracted teeth, severed limbs, and even disemboweled one of his own followers, claiming it was God's will. His paranoia and delusions worsened. He believed himself to be above human law, free to exert his twisted will on those who trusted him most. Followers were forced to endure unimaginable pain in the name of devotion. Some were starved, some were branded with hot irons, and others were beaten to near death. Theriot convinced his followers that their suffering purified them, a grotesque ritual of devotion that only strengthened his grip. Despite the horrors, many followers remained devoted. The cycle of abuse continued for years, until one woman, barely alive, managed to escape. With shattered bones and scars covering her body, she ran until she found help. The authorities were finally alerted. When police raided the compound, they found a scene straight out of a nightmare. Inside, they uncovered the remains of those who had perished under Theriot's rule. The few survivors were weak, malnourished, and mentally broken. Some had lost limbs, others had suffered irreversible trauma. The cult leader himself was unrepentant, believing until the very end that he was divinely chosen. Theriot was arrested in 1989 and sentenced to life in prison. His reign of terror ended, but the scars he left on his followers would never fade. The Anthill Kids remains one of the most horrifying cults to ever exist, a testament to how one man's delusion can become a living hell for others. In the early 1980s, Chicago became the hunting ground of one of the most sadistic and terrifying cults in history. A group known as the Chicago Ripper Crew, led by Robin Gecht, a former associate of the notorious serial killer John Wayne Gacy. This group operated under the guise of satanic rituals, but their crimes were far worse than mere occultism. Women began disappearing. Their bodies, when found, bore horrifying mutilations, ritualistic wounds unlike anything the police had ever seen. Gecht and his three accomplices, Edward Spreitzer and brothers Andrew and Thomas Kokorolais, were abducting, torturing, and murdering women in one of the most twisted killing sprees Chicago had ever witnessed. The crew believed in a perverse form of worship, one that involved ritualistic amputations and organ removal. Their victims suffered unspeakable horrors before meeting their deaths, their bodies discarded as mere sacrifices to a dark force Gecht claimed to serve. The Ripper Crew operated in secrecy, moving from victim to victim with no discernible pattern. They targeted women at random, dragging them to a hidden location where they would be subjected to their gruesome and ritualistic torment. For years, the Ripper Crew evaded capture, but their downfall came when one of their victims miraculously escaped and led police straight to their lair of horrors. What authorities discovered was beyond comprehension, a shrine of mutilation, desecration, and pure evil. The victims' blood had been collected in bowls, their bodies desecrated in ways too gruesome to describe. The police had stumbled upon a scene that felt more like a twisted nightmare than reality. Robin Gecht was sentenced to life in prison. Some of his accomplices were executed, but the terrifying reality remains. For years, an organized cult of murder operated in the heart of Chicago, committing some of the most gruesome crimes imaginable. It started with a dream of utopia. In the 1950s, a man named Jim Jones founded the People's Temple, a religious movement preaching equality, unity, and justice. His charisma drew thousands of followers, people desperate for hope, for belonging. But beneath his words of peace lay a darkness waiting to unfold. By the 1970s, Jones had relocated his followers to the jungles of Guyana, South America. He promised them paradise, a socialist haven free from oppression. But Jonestown, as it was called, became something else entirely, a prison. Jones ruled through fear and paranoia. Followers were cut off from the outside world, subjected to brutal punishments for disobedience. Sleep deprivation, public beatings, and psychological torment were everyday realities. He manipulated them, convincing them that leaving meant death, that the outside world was the enemy. Then, in November 1978, the nightmare reached its peak. A U.S. Congressman, Leo Ryan, traveled to Jonestown to investigate allegations of abuse. But before he could leave, Jones ordered his assassination. His men gunned Ryan and several others down at an airstrip. Jones knew the end was near, and so he gave the final order: mass suicide. Over 900 people, including children, were forced to drink a cyanide-laced concoction. Those who refused, they were shot. When authorities arrived, they found bodies piled upon bodies, a sea of lifeless believers who had followed their leader to the bitter end. Jim Jones was found dead from a gunshot wound. Whether self-inflicted or not remains uncertain. Jonestown stands as one of the deadliest cult massacres in history, a haunting reminder of how blind faith can lead to utter devastation.